Hey everybody, this is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class, and we are still in Unit 7, Lesson 3, and this title is Distribution of Traits. Our key terms for this unit are allele frequency, genotype, gene flow, Hardy-Weinberg equation, and Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And we'll kind of go through this. There's a little bit of some trickier stuff in this lesson, specifically on Hardy-Weinberg the equation. It can be a bit tricky. Some people look at that math and they freak out right away, and I'm going to try to help you out with that a little bit, just so you have a bit of an understanding of how to use it and what it is. But let's go ahead and get started. All right, so this lesson begins with a discussion of how, as an environment changes, so too do the traits, right? The adaptations that help organisms to survive. We've talked about this. Adaptations are characteristics, they're inheritable traits that help an organism to survive. They can be physical attributes, they can be behaviors, but they increase survivability and the ability to find mates. These favorable traits are more likely to be passed on to the next generation, and therefore the frequency of those traits increases because they provide a favorable outcome, right? Those organisms that possess the trait are going to pass those traits on, and so we'll see in the next and subsequent generations that that trait tends to increase in frequency. Remember, those traits are determined by genes, and there are different types of genes that we call alleles. And so when we see the frequency of that trait increase, we also are seeing an increase in the frequency of that allele. So that's where that term allele frequency comes into play. As you see a population changing, you will see a change in the allele frequency of traits. Traits that are more favorable tend to increase in frequency, and traits that are less favorable will decrease in frequency. And traits that really don't provide any kind of favorability at all, negative or positive, will tend to stay pretty constant from generation to generation. So what we can do is we can look at the allele frequency of certain traits, and we can determine whether a population is in fact evolving. If we see a change in that allele frequency over many, many generations, we can conclude that evolution is happening. And this was put into a mathematical equation, um, what's known as Hardy-Weinberg Equation. It talks a bit about this in the bottom of slide 2. It says here that one of the first formulas for analyzing evolution in a population was developed in 1903 by Wilhelm Weinberg and Godfrey Hardy, and the equation is known as the Hardy-Weinberg equation, which we'll talk about. What they hypothesized was that there must be specific factors in place in order for evolution not to happen. That essentially evolution's always going to happen unless these 5 factors are being met, all 5 of them. So you can't have any mutations at all. There can be no gene flow, no immigration, no emigration from a population, no selection, nothing is more or less favorable. Remember that selection just means that there are certain traits that provide any kind of, advantage or disadvantage for survivability. So there's no selection. Mating must be random. That's kind of what we call sexual selection. So there's none of that either. You're just randomly mating different organisms. They don't get to choose based on the mating dance or the color of the plumage or how beautiful the nest is built. I always love birds and how lovely their rituals actually are. And the population size must be very, very large. In fact, they're saying the population must be infinite. So obviously, this is never going to happen. So there is not a population that can ever meet all of the criteria of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Because of that, no population ever remains in a state of equilibrium. In other words, evolution is always happening in all populations at all times. In some, it's going to be happening much more rapidly, and others much more slowly. So there are these factors that determine the rate of evolution as well, right? Just because it's happening doesn't mean it has to be happening rapidly. If you have some of these, for example, lots of selection and lots of gene flow and lots of mutations, you might see more rapid evolution than if you have very, very little of any of these. So there's an equation, and this is where people get really, really freaked out because there's some math. And math isn't always everybody's favorite thing in the world. But this math is demonstrating kind of an equation to determine whether evolution is occurring and at what rate it is happening. It also allows us to determine the frequency of any type of genotype in a population. So we have three kind of main genotypes, right? We have homozygous recessive, we have homozygous dominant, and we have heterozygous. So homozygous recessive would mean, anybody who has possesses that recessive phenotype has to be homozygous recessive because they have both alleles that are recessive, and that's the only way they can display that trait. If they are homozygous dominant, they have two alleles for the dominant trait. And if they are heterozygous, they possess one of each allele. These organisms will still show the dominant trait, though, right? Because the dominant allele always dominates over the recessive one. You add all of these together and you equal 100% of the population. So it equals 1. So our equation is p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. Whereas p is considered our dominant, q is considered the recessive allele, and the equation p squared is the frequency of homozygous dominant, q squared is the frequency of homozygous recessive, and 2pq is the frequency of heterozygous. The other thing, which I don't really do in here, I don't see that in here. I'm going to share this with you. I've actually come up with an example here, is that P plus Q equals 1. If you add up all of the dominant alleles in a population and all of the recessive alleles in a population, you'll end up with 100% of the alleles. That's the 1. So that's kind of the better place to start is P plus Q equals 1. Let's look at our beetles for an example here. I love my beetle. We got our brown beetles and we got our green beetles. And in this population, there are more brown than there are green. Brown is actually the recessive allele. Just remember that just because the allele is dominant or recessive doesn't mean it's predominant, right? Predominance is how many of them there are. And so we see more of the brown beetles in this population. It's the more predominant characteristic, but as a gene, the brown allele is recessive to green. But we do know that all 4 of our brown beetles here have to be homozygous recessive. So let's kind of write this out. So we've got our G is our dominant, right? Big G. Little g is recessive. So we have these 4 guys here, which are all little g, all of them. So we've got 4 of those. And we've got 4 of our 3 green ones that are, I don't know if they're homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. We really just don't know. But they are G something, right? Big G something. We know they have another allele. It could be big G, it could be little g. I don't know for sure. What we do know is if I added up all the little g's and all the big G's, that would be all the alleles that population would actually have. So that is where this equation comes from. P plus Q equals 1. All of them together equal everything there actually is, right? Everything there actually is P plus Q equals 1. So okay, so if the brown beetles, so we have 4 of them, right? 4 out of 7 are brown. When I do that, that's 57% are brown. I can go to this other equation. I'm going to move my picture out of the way. And I know that Q squared, that's the frequency of that allele, or that genotype, is actually 0.57. That's what this number is. Okay? So I can use this information to determine pretty much everything else here. So 0.57 is brown. I also know that I can determine how many, like what the actual presence of this particular allele actually is. This is Q squared, which is 0.57. This is equal to Q squared, right? So to get Q, I'm just going to take the square root of this, and that's going to give me Q. So take 0.57, take the square root. That gives you Q. So Q here is 0.75. If Q is 0.75 and P plus Q equals 1, P has to be 0.25. Okay? So I'm able to kind of retroactively determine the value of Q because I know the population of my brown beetles, of my Q squared. So now I know P is 0.25. So I'm going to take 0.25 squared, which is what this is right here, this first number. So I'm taking 0.25 squared. That's 0.06. I'm just going to put 0.06. So now we have 0.06 plus 2PQ plus 0.57 equals 1. So the question we have here is, what is the frequency of heterozygous beetles? I want to know the value of 2PQ. And I don't really need to do anything else here except for I just need to know what 2PQ is equal to. So if I take these two numbers, this 0.06 and this 0.57, and I subtract them from 1, so I'm going to take 1 and I'm going to subtract 0.06 because that gets rid of that on the left side. And then I'm also then going to subtract 0.57 because again, that gets rid of what's on the left side. So 1 minus 0.06 minus 0.57. That gives me that 2PQ is equal to 0.37. Okay? So this is telling me that in my population, 57% are heterozygous or homozygous recessive, 6% are homozygous dominant, and 37% are heterozygous. Now, that's kind of complicated. I understand that, guys. That this is not like super duper easy at all. And I'm not really having a high expectation that you'll be able to solve a ton of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium problems, okay? But what we do here is we basically base our numbers on the information we get from the number of homozygous recessive individuals in a population because we know their genotypes. We do not know the genotypes of any of our homozygous dominants or any of our heterozygous. We just don't. You can't look at an individual and you can't determine their genotype just by looking at them unless they're homozygous recessive. In that case, they display the recessive characteristic, right? But just by knowing that 4 out of 7 of my beetles are brown, that's where that Q squared came from. Once I get my Q squared, I can solve for Q by taking the square root of that, right? That gives me P, which now gives me P squared, which then enables me to solve for 2PQ. So that's kind of the rundown of this. I'm going to also give you a link here to another video that might be helpful for you to watch for some more practice problems using Hardy-Weinberg. But that's pretty much it for this lesson. Again, this part is a little bit tricky, but I honestly, on your exam with me, I will not have you solve Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium problems because I feel like they're a little bit more advanced. But I do want you to understand um, what Hardy-Weinberg is, and I want you to understand why a population um, really cannot go into Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Understand those 5 characteristics and why a population would really never meet all 5 of those simultaneously. All right, ladies and gents, that is it for me. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you guys in our next lesson.